1842, Boston. The city lay draped in a thick winter fog, each street lamp casting long, trembling shadows across the cobblestones. In a quiet, snow-laden neighborhood, a single house stood silently against the gray morning, seemingly untouched, yet radiating an unsettling wrongness. Within those walls, 12-year-old Clara Whitmore had once laughed, played, and enchanted the small town with her angelic singing voice. But on that fateful day, Clara vanished. Not a window was broken, not a door forced, yet the world she had inhabited felt hollow, as though the very air mourned her disappearance. Neighbors recalled an uncanny stillness, shadows that slithered across the snow and doors that creaked open and closed with no wind to move them. Some swore they glimpsed a small figure at the edge of the woods, vanishing like a phantom before anyone could approach. The Whitmore family, devout and respected in Boston society, were plunged into despair and suspicion. Friends and neighbors whispered theories, each more chilling than the last. A stranger with unknown intent, a criminal lurking in plain sight, or perhaps something far darker, a malevolent force unseen yet palpably present. Clara's innocence contrasted sharply with the shadows that seemed to circle her life, creating a tension that unsettled even the most rational minds. Boston itself, a city of moral rigidity and hidden corruption, became a backdrop for questions that had no answers. Folklore and superstition swirled alongside reasoned investigation. Tales of shadowy figures in the mist, of children who had vanished for no discernible reason, mingled with the meticulous accounts of local authorities and physicians. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, who had examined the Whitmore household, noted nothing unusual, yet his medical letters hinted at an unease he could not articulate. Could it have been human cruelty? Or did unseen forces claim her? The ambiguity gnawed at the townspeople, turning their curiosity into fear. Even decades later, Clara's story refuses to fade. Her voice, remembered by some as hauntingly sweet, seems to echo in the frost-laden streets and the empty rooms she left behind. Each retelling blurs the line between fact and myth, leaving the question of her fate unresolved. Perhaps she was taken by human hands, or perhaps she exists somewhere between reality and legend, a spectral reminder of innocence lost and evil unexplained. The chilling silence that followed her disappearance lingers, urging those who hear the tale to wonder, to debate, to imagine, and to fear the shadows that may still roam the streets of Boston, waiting for another Clara Whitmore. Boston 1842 was a city of contradictions. Its streets, lined with narrow cobblestones, echoed with the clatter of horse-drawn carriages, church bells, and the muffled voices of townsfolk who carried both piety and suspicion in their hearts. The city presented itself as orderly, moral, and deeply devout, yet behind its facades lay alleys thick with crime, neglect, and whispered secrets that few dared to explore openly. In this city, Clara Whitmore was born and raised, a 12-year-old girl whose angelic voice had drawn admirers from every corner of her neighborhood. Her singing, performed with a purity that seemed almost otherworldly, had made her a local treasure, a child whose innocence illuminated even the coldest winter days. Yet, innocence alone could not shield her from the hidden currents swirling through Boston, currents of fear, superstition, and human malevolence. To understand the mystery of her disappearance, one must first peer into the world she inhabited, a world where light and darkness coexisted uneasily, where every cheerful note of her song contrasted sharply with the shadows that stretched across her city. Clara's family, the Whitmores, were devout, disciplined, and outwardly respectable. Neighbors recalled their household as tidy, orderly, and governed by strict moral codes. Yet, within those walls, whispers of tension and secrecy lingered like cobwebs in the corners. Some who knew the family spoke of hushed arguments, unexplained silences, and shadows of past traumas that seemed to haunt their interactions. These unspoken tensions, while subtle, created an environment in which a child's perception of safety was fragile, and innocence was perpetually juxtaposed with potential threat. The contrast between Clara's bright curiosity and the unseen fears around her became one of the defining elements of her early life. Each step she took outside the protective yet secretive confines of her home was a venture into a world where danger could be hidden in the mundane. The shadows of neighbors' gazes, the narrow, foggy streets, the unseen figures glimpsed at the edge of vision. Boston itself contributed to this tension. The city was a labyrinth of narrow streets, dense forests at its edges, and fog that lingered for hours on winter mornings. Its citizens were proud of their moral discipline and devotion to church and community, yet beneath the surface, crime, neglect, and rumor were constant companions. Stories circulated about children who vanished mysteriously, whispers of a dark figure that roamed the outskirts, snatching those who strayed from the safety of the streets. These tales were more than mere entertainment. They were warnings, folklore that both reflected and amplified communal anxieties. Children like Clara were taught caution, yet curiosity was a natural trait, and the intersection of innocence with the dangers lurking in Boston's physical and psychological landscape created a tension that seemed almost palpable. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the local physician who frequently attended the Whitmore family, documented his observations of the city with meticulous care. His letters, preserved in later years, reveal a man acutely aware of the contradictions in Boston life, the coexistence of morality and malevolence, the tension between reason and superstition. He noted that while some families exhibited perfect, outward composure, others concealed emotional strain, secrets or past traumas that quietly shaped the behavior of both parents and children. In his writings, Pritchard described neighborhoods where laughter and joy could exist alongside sudden disappearance, where even the most careful guardians could not account for every danger. His insights underscore the precariousness of childhood in a city where invisible threats lurked everywhere, making Clara's world both familiar and perilously uncertain. Within the Whitmore household, the juxtaposition of love and secrecy was ever present. Clara's parents provided care, devotion, and guidance, yet some observers hinted at undercurrents of unresolved tension. Letters from family friends spoke of unexplained bouts of anger, cryptic references to past misfortunes, and an atmosphere that occasionally seemed heavy with unspoken fear. While no definitive evidence suggested that these dynamics directly endangered Clara, they painted a picture of a household in which innocence was continuously shadowed by subtle unease. For a child as perceptive and sensitive as Clara, these undercurrents would have been felt, even if unarticulated, a constant background hum of tension beneath daily life. The surrounding streets added layers of uncertainty. Boston's winter. Fog could turn ordinary alleys into mysterious corridors where shadows danced unnaturally, where sounds echoed and twisted, and where a passerby could glimpse a fleeting figure at the edge of perception. Residents reported moments when they felt watched, heard voices with no source, or glimpsed movements in the corner of their eyes that vanished upon closer inspection. In a city already rife with stories of disappearances and supernatural fears, these phenomena fed into collective anxiety. Children who wandered even a few steps from home could become subjects of both protective attention and morbid curiosity, their innocence heightened by the ever-present possibility of danger. Folklore played a central role in shaping perceptions of risk. Tales of shadowy figures who claimed children were passed down from generation to generation, mixing fear with moral instruction. Some stories described the figure as almost invisible, moving between light and dark, capable of vanishing without a trace. These narratives, while often exaggerated, reflected psychological truths about human fear, the need to explain the inexplicable, to give form to unseen dangers, and to warn the young. For Clara, exposure to such stories likely created an underlying awareness of vulnerability, a tension between curiosity and caution that would define her movements through her environment. Boston's dualities extended beyond streets and folklore into social interactions. Citizens projected moral rigidity while harboring private anxieties. Families publicly demonstrated virtue yet privately concealed struggles. Innocence was celebrated, yet simultaneously feared. Clara's life unfolded at the intersection of these contrasts. Her brightness, curiosity, and musical talent were celebrated by the community. Yet they did not protect her from the unseen tensions, psychological, social, and environmental, that defined the city. Every day presented opportunities for wonder alongside threats, shaping a reality in which perception and imagination were constantly intertwined. Psychologically, the era's pressures were significant. Children were expected to navigate complex social codes, adhere to strict behavioral norms, and internalize the collective anxieties of their communities. The Whitmore household, while loving, contributed to this complexity through secrecy and unspoken tension. Coupled with the broader societal fears of crime, disappearance, and supernatural forces, the environment created a persistent sense of unease. Clara, sensitive and intelligent, absorbed these cues, moving through her life acutely aware of both beauty and peril. Even thesmoless details of her world reinforced this duality. The smell of soot from chimneys, the whisper of wind through narrow alleys, the sight of strangers' shadows stretching across snow-covered streets, all became ailments of a psychological landscape in which danger was omnipresent yet invisible. The combination of physical, social, and psychological factors created conditions in which a single child's disappearance could occur without immediate explanation. The Whitmore family's history added depth to this tension. Generations of private misfortunes, mental strain, and unexplained events had left echoes in the household, shaping behavior and perception. While no overt danger was apparent, these shadows contributed to an environment where innocence was constantly juxtaposed against potential malevolence. Clara, with her natural curiosity, intuition, and charm, became the focal point of these converging forces. Understanding Boston in 1842, the physical city, the social dynamics, the psychological pressures, and the folklore, is essential to comprehending Clara's world. Every shadowed street, whispered tale, and hidden tension created the conditions that framed her existence. Her disappearance did not emerge in isolation. It was the product of a complex interplay between environment, psychology, and the unseen influences of a city where innocence and danger coexisted. In this context, Clara Whitmore's life becomes a prism through which the contradictions of Boston are magnified. Light and shadow, virtue and malevolence, reason and superstition, all intersected in her daily existence. To understand why she vanished, one must recognize the delicate balance of these forces, the tensions woven into the fabric of her environment, and the fragile boundary between safety and the unknown. Her innocence, once a shield, was exposed to the unseen currents of a world that was at once familiar and treacherous. Every street, every neighbor's glance, every whispered story contributed to a psychological and social landscape in which disappearance was possible, even inevitable. The origins of the mystery are not confined to a single moment butare embedded in the totality of Clara's environment, her family, her city, and the shadows that stretched beyond what eyes could see. Only by appreciating this context can one begin to understand the forces that shaped her final, unresolved journey. The morning Clara Whitmore disappeared, Boston awoke to an unsettling stillness that seemed to seep into every corner of the city. Neighbors later recalled hearing her voice that winter morning, singing the soft, haunting melody that had always drawn smiles from passers-by and admiration from her congregation. But that day, the song ended abruptly, as if swallowed by the dense fog that clung to the streets. Mrs. Abigail Turner, who lived across the street from the Whitmore home, insisted she had heard Clara's voice fading into silence just as she prepared the morning bread. It was like the air itself had taken her away, she recounted decades later, her memory tinged with the same chill that haunted her at the time. Others described the sudden absence of sound, a physical weight pressing against the neighborhood, a quiet so profound it seemed unnatural. Even those who'd never known Clara personally felt the emptiness, an unshakable sensation that something had been torn from the fabric of their ordinary lives. Some neighbors went further, claiming to have glimpsed a cloaked figure near the Whitmore residence on that morning, a shape that moved with unnatural deliberation along the edges of the fog-laden streets. Joseph Harkins, a blacksmith whose shop overlooked the Whitmore home, remembered seeing the figure pause near the corner before vanishing into the mist. His account was precise, yet other neighbors who'd been awake at the same hour reported seeing nothing at all, though they admitted to feeling a sudden cold presence, a chill that ran down their spines without any visible cause. These discrepancies created tension between perception and reality, a contrast that would define much of the narrative surrounding Clara's disappearance. What one person swore was real, another could neither see nor rationalize, leaving room for doubt, fear, and speculation. Children in the neighborhood, more susceptible to suggestion and vivid imagination, added their own voices to the mosaic of witness accounts. Some reported seeing Clara walking toward the edge of the woods, though no adult corroborated these claims. Others spoke of shadows that seemed to follow them when they passed the Whitmore home, lingering just beyond the corner of vision. In these testimonies, the interplay of innocence and fear became evident. Clara's purity, her brightness, her small stature, everything that made her a beloved figure, also amplified the sense of vulnerability perceived by those around her. Observers projected their anxieties onto the situation, blending memory, imagination, and superstition into accounts that were vivid yet contradictory. The tension between fact and perception was further complicated by the human mind's susceptibility to memory distortion, especially under conditions of stress or fear. Witnesses who had been near the Whitmore residence recalled fleeting glimpses, sounds that may not have been, and impressions colored by the collective hysteria of the community. For some, the cold presence they felt was real. For others, it was a psychological echo of the anxiety sweeping through the streets of Boston. The contrast between what was objectively verifiable and what was internally experienced created a fragile framework for understanding the events of that morning. In this liminal space between perception and reality, the mystery of Clara's disappearance took on an almost supernatural quality, as if the boundaries of the ordinary world had shifted and blurred. Local clergy and townsfolk attempted to reconcile these accounts with reason. Reverend Jonathan Pierce, who often heard Clara sing in church, suggested that fear and rumor were amplifying ordinary events. Yet even he admitted, in letters preserved for posterity, that he could not ignore the feeling of unease that gripped the neighborhood. The young girl's voice, once a source of joy, had abruptly ceased, leaving a void that reason alone could not explain. While some dismissed the idea of a cloaked figure or malevolent presence, others found the very absence of clarity unsettling. In Boston, where moral order and social propriety were deeply ingrained, the inability to explain what had occurred challenged the very framework through which residents understood their lives. These early witness accounts also reveal the psychology of fear, especially as it relates to childhood innocence. Children by nature respond intensely to ambiguity, and the disappearance of a peer like Clara magnified this response. Reports from schoolmates describe quiet sobbing, whispered rumors, and a pervasive sense of foreboding that seemed to hang over classrooms and playgrounds alike. The blending of actual observation with imagination produced accounts that were both sincere and contradictory, highlighting how innocence can intensify the perception of threat. Each retelling, whether from an adult or a child, carried with it the imprint of emotional and cognitive filters, shaping the narrative into something that was part reality, part myth. The figure in the cloak, real or imagined, became a focal point for speculation. Some theorized it was a stranger, perhaps a criminal with sinister intent, taking advantage of the fog and the early hour. Others suggested something less corporeal, a shadow that moved with intent yet could not be physically confronted. The community, already attuned to stories of vanished children and supernatural forces, was primed to interpret ambiguity as evidence of malevolent design. In the absence of concrete proof, these interpretations took root, blending the real with the imagined and leaving a lingering tension between human psychology and superstition. Neighbors' accounts frequently conflicted, in detail but aligned in emotional resonance. There was fear, palpable and contagious, a sense that the very air had shifted. Windows were observed to rattle without wind, doors were said to open or close inexplicably, and faint, indistinct sounds were reported from the periphery of perception. Even skeptics, who had initially dismissed the idea of a mysterious figure, admitted to moments of unease that could not be rationally explained. In these small, seemingly insignificant phenomena, the city itself seemed to participate in the shaping of the mystery, creating an environment in which even ordinary events could assume ominous significance. The earliest witnesses also highlighted the role of communal narrative in shaping perception. Stories were retold at markets, in church, and in the quiet corners of homes, each iteration adding subtle embellishments or emphasizing elements that reinforced fear. This social amplification transformed isolated observations into a shared sense of dread, solidifying the tension between individual experience and collective understanding. Clara, by virtue of her innocence and the abruptness of her disappearance, became a vessel through which these dynamics coalesced. Her absence was more than a physical void. It was a psychological and social event that reverberated through the neighborhood and beyond. As the day progressed, witness accounts continued to arrive in conflicting layers. Some swore they had seen Clara near the edge of the woods, turning back as if called by someone unseen. Others reported shadows that moved independently of any person, disappearing into mist or behind buildings. These accounts underscore the interplay of memory, suggestion, and fear, demonstrating how rapidly perception can diverge from objective reality in moments of crisis. The human mind, particularly when confronted with ambiguity, seeks patterns, imposes causality, and often attributes intention to randomness, a phenomenon that explains much of the conflicting testimony surrounding Clara's disappearance. The reports also reveal the social psychology of fear. Adults, already anxious about their children and the moral state of the city, projected their anxieties onto the events of the morning. Children, impressionable and observant, internalized these cues and added their own interpretations, blending imagination with observation. Together, these layers of perception created a complex, self-reinforcing narrative in which the unknown became tangible, threatening, and impossible to ignore. Clara's innocence, her vulnerability, and her sudden absence amplified the emotional weight of these accounts, ensuring that the mystery of her disappearance would resonate deeply with everyone who bore witness. The interplay of superstition and psychology is evident in nearly every account. Some witnesses attributed the events to malevolent forces or spirits, invoking local folklore that had long warned of shadows taking children. Others clung to rational explanations, suggesting a stranger or a deliberate abduction. Yet even the rational voices were colored by the pervasive sense of unease, admitting that something about the day felt wrong in a way that could not be measured or quantified. In this tension between reason and fear, between observable fact and psychological impression, the narrative of Clara's disappearance began to take shape. As dusk approached, the collective unease had solidified into panic. Neighborhoods were patrolled, searches organized, and families tightened their vigilance. Witness statements, when compiled, painted a picture of uncertainty, contradiction, and emotional intensity. The absence of Clara was now a focal point for both observation and speculation, a puzzle whose pieces refused to fit neatly together. The city itself seemed complicit, its streets, fog, and shadows, forming a stage upon which perception, superstition, and memory intertwined in complex, sometimes terrifying ways. Even decades later, the earliest witness accounts remain a study in the tension between reality and interpretation. They illustrate how human perception, shaped by innocence, fear, and social context, can both illuminate and obscure truth. Clara Whitmore's disappearance viewed through these testimonies becomes more than a missing child. It becomes a lens through which to understand the fragility of perception, the amplification of fear, and the persistent influence of folklore on human consciousness. Each account, whether of sight, sound, or sensation, contributed to a mosaic of uncertainty that would guide investigation, speculation, and collective memory for generations. The morning after Clara Whitmore's disappearance, Boston awoke to a city caught between disbelief and mounting fear. Authorities, faced with a missing 12-year-old girl, were compelled to act, yet the tools at their disposal were rudimentary, relying heavily on human observation, intuition, and methodical legwork rather than modern forensic science. The Boston police, alongside local volunteers and members of the militia, began door-to-door searches that extended through the winding streets and alleyways of the city. Every home, cellar, and abandoned corner was examined. Footprints in the fresh snow were traced meticulously, yet none provided a clear trail. Every sign of movement, every slight indentation in the frost, was scrutinized for evidence of a stranger or malevolent force. Despite these efforts, tangible clues were scarce, and the streets seemed to swallow questions as quickly as they were asked. Witnesses were interviewed repeatedly, their testimonies forming a fragmented mosaic of perceptions. The adults who had heard Clara's voice fade into silence were questioned extensively, as were the children who claimed to have glimpsed shadows near the Whitmore home. Yet discrepancies abounded. One witness would describe a cloaked figure moving north along the street, while another insisted the figure had vanished entirely. Some claimed to see Clara running toward the edge of the forest. Others swore she had never left the house. These conflicting accounts highlighted the fragility of human memory and the psychological distortions inherent in fear and uncertainty. Each conversation, each retelling, seemed to draw the investigation further into ambiguity. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, the local physician whose observations had already informed residents of Boston's fraught social dynamics, contributed both medical insight and, unexpectedly, elements of superstition. In letters he sent to colleagues, he noted symptoms of hysteria among neighbors, describing sleepless nights, rapid heartbeats, and pervasive unease. Yet he also acknowledged that the city's collective imagination was coloring perception, that some insisted on the involvement of demonic forces or curses. Pritchard's dual perspective encapsulated the struggle between rational investigation and the human desire for narrative when confronted with inexplicable events. The tension between science and superstition, fact and fear, would define not only this investigation but the broader legacy of Clara Whitmore's disappearance. As searches continued, unverified sightings of Clara in neighboring towns emerged. Letters and notes described a girl matching her description wandering through the outskirts of Roxbury, peering from doorways in Charlestown, or even glimpsed briefly in the fog-shrouded streets of South Boston. Each report reignited hope, yet none could be confirmed. These claims illustrate the way rumors spread, morphing and taking on a life of their own. In a community already primed for anxiety, even the most tenuous sighting became evidence, feeding both desperation and hysteria. The lines between truth and fiction blurred, leaving investigators and townsfolk alike questioning the reliability of every observation. The Boston authorities struggled to impose order on an inherently chaotic situation. Militia patrols combed the streets systematically, while magistrates coordinated with neighbors to map out Clara's last known movements. Yet despite rigorous documentation, the absence of concrete evidence rendered progress nearly impossible. Questions multiplied. Had she left voluntarily, tempted by curiosity? Had she been taken by a stranger exploiting the city's fog and narrow streets? Or had some malevolent force, whether human or otherwise, claimed her? Each possibility carried its own weight, its own moral and psychological implication, and each was contested by those who sought clarity in the face of fear. Community panic intensified as days turned into weeks. Mothers kept children indoors, teachers recounted sobbing, students unable to focus on lessons, and neighbors whispered anxiously about the shadows they believed lingered near the Whitmore home. Some of these whispers took on a supernatural character, claiming that Clara had been taken by a curse or a demonic entity. Others invoked psychological explanations, suggesting that an unseen predator, human in form, had abducted her. The contrast between rational speculation and imaginative interpretation revealed the fragility of communal perception, demonstrating how hysteria can amplify uncertainty into terror. Investigators relied heavily on cross-examination and repeated interviews, attempting to separate memory from imagination. They noted, for instance, that witnesses often described the cloaked figure differently each time they were questioned. The height changed, the posture altered, the timing shifted. Children, especially, could not consistently recount the sequence of events, their fear interwoven with their imagination. Adults, while more measured, were not immune to suggestion. Dr. Pritchard himself recorded cases of neighbors misremembering sounds, mistaking ordinary echoes for sinister signals. In this environment, truth became slippery, retreating before the combined pressure of observation, rumor, and psychological tension. Letters from Clara's parents reveal the personal dimension of this struggle. They described anguish, sleepless nights, and the gnawing sensation that their daughter's absence was not merely a local event, but a rupture in the moral fabric of the city itself. They implored authorities to leave no stone unturned, yet acknowledged in private correspondence that even the most methodical search might fail against the unknown. Their despair mirrored that of the community, reflecting a shared experience of uncertainty that blended grief with mounting fear. In this way, personal tragedy intertwined with collective hysteria, reinforcing both the urgency of the investigation and the pervasive sense that forces beyond comprehension might be at play. The psychology of mass fear played a crucial role in shaping the narrative. Communities under stress often turn to story, assigning meaning and agency to events that might otherwise remain unexplained. In Boston, every rumor about Clara's disappearance, whether the cloaked figure, sightings in distant towns, or whispered curses, served as a cognitive anchor, a way for people to make sense of their anxiety. Hysteria, amplified by repetition, and social reinforcement, ensured that the city's response was both methodical and frenzied, scientific and imaginative, a duality that reflected the human need to impose order while acknowledging the incomprehensible. Superstition intertwined seamlessly with empirical investigation. Some townspeople provided leads based on dreams, visions, or premonitions, while authorities attempted to catalog footprints, interview witnesses, and search systematically. These contrasting methods existed side by side, often intersecting in ways that confounded clarity. A footprint in the snow might be interpreted as evidence of human abduction by investigators, while the same mark was described by neighbors as proof of supernatural intervention. In this overlap, the narrative of Clara's disappearance became a blend of objective observation and culturally shaped fear, a story whose contours were shaped as much by imagination as by evidence. The social dynamics of Boston added another layer of complexity. Economic disparity, moral expectation, and family secrecy all contributed to a heightened sensitivity to unusual events. Observers were quick to interpret minor anomalies as portentous, amplifying collective anxiety. In the case of Clara Whitmore, these dynamics were amplified by her age, her innocence, and her prominence as a beloved figure in the community. Each new rumor, each conflicting witness statement, served to intensify public concern, creating a feedback loop in which fear generated speculation, and speculation reinforced fear. Attempts to consolidate evidence proved challenging. Investigators documented every reported sighting, every claimed shadow, every whispered account. They compared notes, cross-referenced statements, and tracked possible routes, yet nothing yielded definitive results. Even those elements that appeared concrete, the footprints in snow, the observed moments of silence, the reports of a cloaked figure, were subject to interpretation. Investigators acknowledged the possibility of misperception, yet the emotional weight of each report demanded serious attention. In this tension between empirical diligence and human fallibility, the investigation itself became part of the legend of Clara Whitmore, a testament to the fragility of certainty when confronted with the unknown. Letters from Dr. Pritchard, combined with accounts from neighbors, highlight the duality between rationality and myth. He documented symptoms of anxiety and hysteria with clinical precision, while noting the prevalence of superstition in public discourse. His dual perspective reflects the struggle to reconcile objective observation with human interpretation. For EI, every rational hypothesis, abduction by a stranger, misdirection, or accidental wandering, there existed an equally compelling narrative fueled by imagination and fear, curses, demonic forces, or shadowed predators beyond human comprehension. This interplay of science and narrative defines much of the enduring fascination with Clara Whitmore's disappearance, illustrating how uncertainty breeds both inquiry and myth. Even as authorities pursued systematic investigation, rumors continued to spread. Each day brought fresh reports, each more sensational than the last. A child sighting in Charlestown, a shadow in the fog near the river, whispers of a cloaked figure disappearing into alleyways, all became woven into the fabric of the investigation, creating a tapestry in which truth and fiction were inseparable. The distinction between reality and interpretation blurred, highlighting the human need for narrative closure in situations of extreme uncertainty. By the end of the first month, Boston had entered a state of tense vigilance. Neighborhoods organized, patrols, families scrutinized every passerby, and the city itself seemed to take on a heightened sense of awareness. Every echo, every movement, every shadow became a potential clue, reinforcing the tension between empirical observation and imaginative fear. Clara's disappearance, still unexplained, had transformed the city into both a crime scene and a stage for collective anxiety. where reason and superstition existed in uneasy coexistence. Even decades after Clara Whitmore's disappearance, speculation about her fate persisted, intertwining rational inquiry with legend, fact with conjecture, psychology with superstition. The town of Boston, though modernizing and expanding, seemed perpetually haunted by her absence, as if the very streets retained an echo of that fateful winter morning. Scholars, local historians, and storytellers proposed theories, some grounded in historical possibility, others veiled in the shadowy allure of folklore. Each theory sought to fill the gap left by the lack of closure, yet every explanation seemed simultaneously plausible and unsettling. In homes where the Whitmore story was retold, the line between myth and reality blurred, leaving each listener to navigate a labyrinth of potential truths and darker possibilities. One prevailing theory suggested that Clara had fallen victim to an opportunistic stranger. This hypothesis, grounded in the practical realities of crime in 1842 Boston, cited reports of itinerant workers, transient merchants, and unsavory characters wandering through neighborhoods. Yet, despite extensive searches and the scrutiny of the militia, no concrete evidence ever emerged to implicate a specific individual. Footprints faded into snow, and eyewitness accounts conflicted, providing tantalizing hints without resolution. The plausibility of abduction by a stranger was reinforced by the human tendency to assign intentionality to unexplained events. In the absence of proof, the imagination filled gaps with sinister potential. Here, the rational mind and fear-driven speculation intersected, creating a theory that could not be fully confirmed nor entirely dismissed. Another theory, steeped in local folklore, posited that Clara had been taken by supernatural forces, entities that lurked at the edge of human perception, drawn to innocence or vulnerability. Folk tales of the region spoke of shadowed figures, phantoms and spirits capable of removing children from the mortal world, leaving families bereft and communities unsettled. These accounts, though unverifiable, resonated deeply with townsfolk, many of whom had grown up steeped in cautionary tales that blended moral instruction with fear of the unknown. Witnesses' recollections of cloaked figures, sudden chills, and vanishing shadows were seamlessly integrated into these narratives, reinforcing the sense that Clara's disappearance transcended ordinary explanation. The supernatural theory, whether believed literally or as metaphor, underscored the tension between innocence and malevolent forces, reflecting the human need to conceptualize evil beyond the tangible. Psychological explanations offered a different lens through which to understand the mystery. Some scholars and modern interpreters suggest that Clara, in a moment of curiosity or distress, may have wandered away from home, becoming lost in the dense woods or abandoned parts of the city. From this perspective, the story's supernatural elements are reframed as products of collective anxiety, memory distortion, and the human tendency to amplify trauma into narrative. Cognitive biases, such as the availability heuristic and confirmation bias, may have caused witnesses to recall and reinterpret events in ways that heightened fear, while oral traditions transformed small anomalies into evidence of greater threats. This psychological lens highlights the intersection of perception, memory, and community trauma, suggesting that the enduring mystery is as much a product of the human mind as it is of historical events. Letters from Dr. Samuel Pritchard, preserved in local archives, reflect his ambivalent approach to these competing theories. On one hand, he meticulously documented environmental factors, human behaviors, and medical observations. On the other, he admitted to feeling an unexplained dread surrounding the case. Pritchard's writings oscillate between clinical rationality and acknowledgement of forces he could not define, revealing the inherent tension between reason and the unknown. His duality mirrors the city itself, a place rooted in civic order and religious morality, yet persistently vulnerable to rumor, superstition, and the shadows of human fear. Pritchard's reflections serve as a bridge between empirical investigation and narrative construction, demonstrating how even those trained in observation were not immune to the psychological currents surrounding Clara's disappearance. Descendants of witnesses contribute further dimensions to the tapestry of theories. Families pass down stories of sightings in the woods, hearing Clara's voice calling from hidden corners or glimpsing fleeting shadows in alleys long abandoned. Some interpretations framed her fate as a cautionary tale, a moral lesson embedded in narrative form. Others embraced the idea of a lingering spirit, a presence neither fully corporeal nor entirely imagined. Across generations, these accounts adapted to the cultural milieu of each era, integrating contemporary fears, religious beliefs, and psychological frameworks. In this way, Clara's story evolved, not merely as a historical event, but as a living narrative shaped by the interpretive lens of each new generation. The interplay between rational and mythical explanations is further complicated by sporadic reports of unexplained phenomena throughout Boston. Residents over decades claim to hear soft angelic singing in fog-laden streets, witness fleeting figures at dusk, or feel sudden chills reminiscent of the original reports. While skeptics attribute these experiences to auditory pareidolia, misperceived shadows, or collective suggestion, believers find in them validation of long-standing folklore. The coexistence of rational skepticism and supernatural interpretation ensures that the story remains compelling, resisting resolution and perpetuating a sense of unease. Each unexplained event serves as reinforcement for the mystery, sustaining narrative momentum and reinforcing the emotional resonance of Clara's absence. Historical documents suggest that public fascination with Clara's disappearance influenced other contemporary narratives of missing children. Newspapers, pamphlets, and local anecdotes drew parallels between her case and subsequent vanishings, highlighting themes of vulnerability, innocence, and community anxiety. Scholars have noted the way in which such stories, once codified in print and oral tradition, interact with societal expectations, religious morality, and the human tendency to seek patterns in chaos. Clara's story, in this sense, functions as both a singular event and a symbolic reference point, shaping collective consciousness and influencing the ways in which subsequent absences are interpreted and memorialized. The passage of time did not diminish the fascination. Rather, it allowed the integration of additional layers of meaning. Authors, folklorists, and later historians contributed speculative narratives that blended documentation with imagination. In some retellings, Clara's innocence and angelic voice were elevated to mythic proportions, while the cloaked figure became emblematic of malevolent forces lurking in the everyday world. These narratives, though often sensationalized, retained the unsettling core of the original disappearance, the abrupt interruption of a life that seemed too fragile, too luminous, to vanish without trace. The story's persistence underscores the human inclination to preserve memory, explore fear, and confront uncertainty through narrative form. Subplots further complicate the landscape of theories. Unverified sightings in neighboring towns, whispered rumors of strangers with unclear motives, and accounts of environmental anomalies, sudden fog, shadowed figures, or inexplicable cold, populate the historical record. Each of these subplots, whether true, imagined, or misremembered, contributes to the overarching ambiguity. Investigators and historians alike struggle to separate kernel from fiction, yet the blending of these elements forms the very texture that renders Clara Whitmore's story compelling across generations. The coexistence of multiple narrative threads ensures that the disappearance remains unresolved, each thread offering tantalizing possibilities without yielding certainty. Folklorists have noted the symbolic resonance of recurring motifs in these narratives. Shadows at the edge of perception, abrupt silences, and angelic singing all serve as cultural anchors, framing Clara as both an individual and a symbol. These motifs allow for a shared interpretive experience, in which listeners and readers connect emotionally to the story, even in the absence of verifiable fact. The interplay of personal memory, collective imagination, and environmental cues generates a narrative that is simultaneously haunting, instructive, and resistant to closure. In essence, Thestery persists because it fulfills psychological and cultural needs, providing a framework for understanding innocence, vulnerability, and the unknown. Theories about human involvement continue to circulate alongside supernatural interpretations. Some argue that the cloaked figure represented an opportunistic criminal exploiting societal naivety and community trust. Others suggest that social neglect, family secrecy, or unresolved trauma within the Whitmore household may have contributed to circumstances that allowed Clara to vanish unnoticed. Each human-centered theory wrestles with questions of morality, culpability, and the boundaries between neglect and malevolence. In juxtaposition to folklore, these interpretations anchor the story in the tangible world, highlighting contrasts between the known and unknown, rationality and fear, innocence and predation. Psychological inquiry remains an essential tool for understanding the story's persistence. Fear, memory distortion, and collective anxiety shape narratives, influencing both witnesses and subsequent generations. Cognitive processes, such as the reconstructive nature of memory and the amplification of emotionally charged details, ensure that stories evolve in ways that maintain suspense and mystery. In Clara's case, the interplay of individual and communal cognition transformed her disappearance into a cultural touchstone, a story whose layers of uncertainty, fear, and myth converge to create enduring fascination. Even the city itself seems complicit, its foggy streets, narrow alleys, and dense forests providing a backdrop that encourages speculation and reinforces tension. Environmental cues, visual, auditory, and tactile, interact with psychological predispositions to produce a perception of danger and mystery. The physical landscape, combined with the human mind's interpretive tendencies, generates a narrative that transcends the purely factual, ensuring that Clara's story continues to evoke emotion and contemplation across time. The tapestry of theories and myths surrounding Clara Whitmore's disappearance reflects a fundamental human need: to interpret, explain, and find meaning in the face of uncertainty. Rational investigation, folklore, psychology, and collective memory intersect to create a story that is simultaneously historical, symbolic, and haunting. No single explanation resolves the tension, leaving her absence a focal point for speculation, fear, and reflection. Each retelling, each new observer, contributes to the ongoing evolution of the narrative, ensuring that Clara Whitmore's story remains alive, unsettling, and perpetually unresolved, a shadow cast across centuries of imagination and inquiry. Even decades after Clara Whitmore vanished, the debate surrounding her fate persisted with a persistence that blurred the lines between history, memory, and myth. Theories proliferated, each attempting to fill the void left by her absence, yet none could provide a definitive resolution. Among the most rational explanations was the possibility of abduction by a stranger. Boston in 1842, though a city of emerging commerce and strict moral codes, still harbored hidden dangers in the form of transient workers, itinerant merchants, and isolated alleyways. Residents reported glimpses of cloaked figures near the Whitmore residence in the days before Clara's disappearance, yet these accounts were inconsistent and often contradictory. Footprints that might have belonged to an abductor vanished in the snow, leaving authorities with tantalizing yet inconclusive evidence. Investigators combed streets and questioned individuals known for past misdeeds, but their efforts yielded no leads. The possibility of human predation, while grounded in observable reality, remained unsatisfyingly incomplete, leaving room for imagination to fill the void with ever darker possibilities. Parallel to these rational considerations were explanations rooted in Boston's folklore and the supernatural. The city's outskirts were said to harbor shadowy figures capable of crossing the boundary between the known and the unknown, beings drawn to innocence and vulnerability. Witnesses over the decades described sudden chills, inexplicable movements at the edge of vision, and fleeting sounds resembling Clara's angelic voice. Oral histories and family legends carried these accounts, framing Clara's disappearance as an encounter with forces beyond comprehension. The supernatural narrative offered coherence where the human mind struggled with uncertainty. In this interpretation, Clara became both a child and a symbol, her absence emblematic of innocence confronted by malevolent, inscrutable powers. The recurrence of motifs, vanishing shadows, abrupt silences, distant singing, reinforced the sense of a pattern, a logic of terror that eluded empirical verification yet remained compelling in the collective imagination. Psychological perspectives provide a third lens, reframing the mystery in terms of perception, memory, and collective anxiety. Witness recollections were inevitably filtered through fear, expectation, and social influence. Memory is reconstructive, particularly for emotionally charged events involving children and unexplained occurrences, meaning details were amplified, altered, or conflated over time. Fog, shadows, and silence, already present in the environment, were magnified by communal anxiety, producing experiences that may have been as much cognitive projection as empirical reality. Cognitive biases, such as confirmation bias, where people interpret ambiguous stimuli in line with existing fears, amplified the perception of danger. Collective trauma embedded Clara's disappearance into Boston's cultural and psychological fabric, ensuring the story's persistence. In this view, the narrative's enduring power arises not from objective fact alone, but from the human mind's response to uncertainty, fear, and unresolved absence. Historical records, including letters from Dr. Samuel Pritchard, illustrate the tension between rational investigation and subjective interpretation. Pritchard documented environmental conditions, human behaviors, and anecdotal evidence meticulously, yet admitted feelings of dread he could not rationalize. He described neighbors' perceptions of a presence, shadows, or vanishing figures that defied ordinary explanation. His writings reflect aduality, scientific observation alongside acknowledgement, of forces that seem to transcend reason. Pritchard's ambivalence mirrors the city itself, an urban landscape steeped in moral structure yet shadowed by uncertainty, rumor, and fear. His reflections reveal the difficulty of reconciling empirical data with psychological and folkloric realities, highlighting the fragility of certainty in the face of ambiguity. Modern scholarship continues to grapple with these competing narratives. Psychologists, folklorists, and criminologists evaluate social context, cognitive factors, and environmental conditions to interpret the case. Some propose that Clara may have wandered into the outskirts of Boston, becoming lost or succumbing to exposure, while the supernatural accounts arose from fear and memory distortion. Others emphasize human culpability, citing patterns of child abduction, historically documented in urban settings. Even contemporary analysis acknowledges the influence of folklore, as repeated motifs, fog, shadows, singing, shape perception and memory, reinforcing the story's emotional and cultural resonance. Each theory, incomplete though it may be, contributes to the enduring fascination with Clara's disappearance. Conflicting witness accounts complicate interpretation. One resident claimed to see a figure carrying a small child toward the river, while another insisted the figure disappeared into thin air. Decades later, descendants recall hearing Clara singing in deserted streets or glimpsing fleeting shadows, experiences framed by inherited narrative, suggestion, and memory. Each account reinforces contrasts between innocence and evil, the visible and the hidden, reality and imagination. The absence of clarity amplifies suspense, inviting ongoing speculation while preserving the story's psychological grip. Religious interpretations also intersect with these theories. Clergy often framed the disappearance as a moral or spiritual lesson, a reminder of the fragility of innocence and the potential presence of malevolent forces in everyday life. Sermons, diaries, and parish records present Clara's story as emblematic, blending theology with communal anxiety. Spiritual narratives coexist with rational and folkloric interpretations, layering meaning upon meaning and complicating the search for objective truth. This interplay of faith, psychology, and legend highlights the multidimensionality of the mystery, offering no definitive answers while enriching its symbolic power. The environmental context of Boston contributed to these interpretations. Dense woods, foggy streets, and narrow alleys amplified fear and uncertainty, creating conditions in which misperception was likely. Shadows appeared deeper than reality, sounds carried differently, and familiar streets seemed strange and unwelcoming. These factors, coupled with cognitive and emotional predispositions, created fertile ground for myth and speculation. Environmental cues, memory, and imagination fused, producing a narrative that is as much a phenomenon of place and perception as of historical fact. Community debate persisted across decades. Some believed Clara was a victim of circumstance, lost or endangered by accident. Others insisted darker forces were at play, referencing shadowed figures and unexplained phenomena. Newspapers periodically revived the story, presenting new interpretations and sparking renewed discussion. The diversity of opinions ensured that no consensus could be reached, reinforcing the narrative's enduring ambiguity. Rather than diminishing intrigue, these debates embedded Clara's story into Boston's collective memory, transforming it into an unresolved cultural touchstone. Recurring motifs in accounts, angelic singing, sudden silence, fleeting shadows, suggest symbolic coherence across narratives. Psychologists interpret these consistencies as the mind's method of organizing trauma and uncertainty, creating familiar patterns to navigate incomprehensible events. Historians and folklorists note that the persistence of such motifs enhances the story's resonance, bridging gaps between fact and interpretation. Clara's narrative demonstrates how memory, imagination, and cultural expectation combine to sustain intrigue, leaving her absence eternally enigmatic. Human-centered theories continue alongside supernatural ones. Some posit an opportunistic criminal exploited societal gaps, while others suggest familial neglect or social pressure contributed to circumstances allowing her disappearance. Each theory wrestles with morality, culpability, and vulnerability, highlighting contrast between innocence and calculated harm. These interpretations, juxtaposed with folklore, illustrate the complexity of understanding a disappearance in which rational and irrational forces intertwine. The story resists resolution. Each explanation, abduction, wandering, supernatural intervention, offers fragments without closure. Rationality collides with myth, psychology with religion, innocence with malevolence. Viewers and scholars are left in tension, questioning boundaries of knowledge and perception. Some assert her disappearance is unknowable. Others seek rational closure. The enduring debate becomes part of the story itself, a testament to the power of mystery, memory, and imagination. Clara Whitmore's absence persists, suspended between fact and legend, leaving a haunting question that lingers in the fog. Was she a victim of circumstance, or claimed by forces beyond comprehension? Clara Whitmore's disappearance remains an echo that refuses to fade, a shadow cast over Boston's history, streets, and imagination. The facts are sparse, fragmented, and often contradictory, yet their scarcity only amplifies the haunting resonance of what was lost. Was she abducted by a human predator, clever and untraceable, someone who knew how to move through the fog-shrouded streets without leaving a hint? Or did she wander unknowingly into the outskirts of the city, falling victim to the unforgiving winter cold, her bright angelic presence extinguished by chance and circumstance? Others have long whispered of darker possibilities, forces beyond comprehension, drawn to innocence, operating outside the reach of human understanding, leaving behind nothing but an unsettling silence. Each possibility is equally chilling, equally plausible, yet none provide closure. The absence of certainty transforms the story itself into a psychological labyrinth, where every interpretation casts long shadows over reason and memory. The city of Boston itself becomes a character in Clara's tale, a place of stark contrasts, where devout morality and shadowed alleys coexist, where community vigilance clashes with isolation, and where fog and darkness distort both perception and memory. Her disappearance, viewed through the eyes of neighbors, historians, and descendants, is shaped not only by events, but by the interpretations and fears of those who tell her story. Angelic songs recalled in memory, fleeting glimpses at the forest's edge, unexplained coldness in the streets, and shadowed figures at doorways all weave together, blurring fact, rumor, and legend into an inseparable tapestry of mystery. The psychological dimension of Clara's disappearance is equally compelling. Her innocence, her brightness, and her vulnerability amplify the tension between what was known and what remained unknowable. Memory, already fragile and prone to distortion, has transformed the case into an emotional landscape where perception and imagination intersect. Witnesses' accounts diverge, sometimes subtly, sometimes drastically, yet each recounting reinforces the eerie sense that something profound, unsettling, and unresolved lies at the heart of the story. Cognitive biases, collective anxiety, and folklore have combined to ensure that Clara's tale continues to resonate, compelling each generation to grapple anew with the uncertainty of her fate. Religion, superstition, and rationality collide within the narrative, each framework offering partial understanding while raising new questions. Sermons, letters, and oral traditions suggest divine or malevolent spiritual involvement, while meticulous investigations and historical records strive to impose order and explanation. None succeed entirely. The story thrives in this tension, drawing audiences into contemplation, debate, and speculation. The angelic voice that once filled Boston streets, now silenced, reverberates in the imagination as both memory and warning. Perhaps the truth died with Clara, swallowed by winter fog and lost to time. Perhaps it lingers still, unseen, echoing faintly in shadows, waiting for discovery or acknowledgement. The story leaves us questioning morality, psychology, and the supernatural, challenging our understanding of innocence and evil, reality and myth. One certainty endures: the sinister silence she left behind continues to haunt, to unsettle, and to provoke reflection. What really happened that winter morning in Boston? The answer remains elusive, a chilling question without conclusion, lingering in the cold air and the mind alike.